When you say nation, you talk about land. Our land is Africa. That's undeniable. This land is not our land.
That what Frantz Fanon's theory, psychological theory, is that we're in a post-colonial psychology. And what he calls that is an auto-destructional stage, which is the oppressor will oppress for so long that the oppressed no longer have to be physically oppressed. They do it to themselves automatically.
I'm black. Do you hear me, man? Do you understand? I am black. I'm a nigga. You understand me? I was born black. I live black. And I'm gonna die probably because I'm black. Because some cracker that knows I'm black better than you, nigga, is probably gonna put a bullet in the back of my head.
Hey, man, it's like this, man. It's like, you know, it's like it's revolution time, man. There's no questions asked. Revolution is here. You know what I'm saying? We the youth, we the young. It's time for us to break loose, you know? We don't have no freedom, no rights, man. We slaves right now. Everybody's still a slave. That's what they told us today. In other words, you still a slave. No matter how much money you got, you still ain't shit. So, you know, it's on, just like that. Just like
are really ready and willing to pay the price that is necessary for freedom. Our people will always be walking around here second-class citizens, or what you call 20th century slaves.
What price are you talking about, sir?
The price of freedom is death.
What's the figure?
I mean, what are you in this for? You want power, you want revenge, you know? What is it?
It's simple, Willie. I just want to be free.
Hey, I just want the hoodoo. Peace, family. This is Ikemba Ajore of We Charge Colonialism. I'm coming back with another Blueprint for Black Power study. We're covering Dr. Amerson Wilson's text, The Blueprint for Black Power. This thick book right here, Moral, Political, and Economic Imperative for the 21st Century. And here we are in the 21st century. So it's only right that we carry out the mandates that Baba Dr. Wilson had left for us. This and many other works that I tend to study to make sure that I'm on the right path and doing the right thing when it comes to struggling for the liberation of African people. With that being said, this is actually the 28th study that I have done on the text. I'm going to do an overview of chapters 1 and 2 today. I didn't finish chapter 2, but I plan on, I'm basically changing my approach to the text. So I'm going to do an overview of chapters 1 and 2 today. And then next week at the same time, same day, same time, I'll be covering chapter 3. So if you haven't picked up Dr. Amerson's book, Blueprint for Black Power, make sure you pick it up. And definitely want you to join me as we endeavor to get through this whole textbook. So with that being said, I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint actually, and there's a lot of material to cover. So, you know, peace to everybody out there. Hey, Nico Zori, Nduku. Make sure you like and share the podcast. Like and share this study because it should be thousands. Just imagine if there was thousands of us studying this textbook and talking about putting into practice what is laid out in this book. How much more work we would get done. You know, how much more powerful we would be with this collective consciousness and collective approach to solving our problems. So make sure you like and share. And if this your first time coming to this channel, make sure you subscribe to the subscribe to the channel so that you can get updates whenever we're having a podcast. Come back to Thursday at 1:00. I will be covering another Dr. Amerson Wilson's text, Black on Black Violence. So if you haven't read that or picked that book up, you can pick that up as well, because I'll be covering that book on Thursdays, Dr. Amerson Wilson's Black on Black Violence. So right now I'm going to share my screen. We're going to get right into it because, like I said, it's a lot of material to cover. And hopefully you have time to go through this text with me today. Give me 1 second. I mean, I actually had this set up. I don't even know what just happened. Where's my PowerPoint just disappeared on me that quick. Uh-oh, I got a message. Your browser has blocked your screen. Look at the man. The man trying to keep me from giving you this information. Here we go. My browser is blocked all of a sudden. Okay. All right, so what I'm going to do is enlarge my screen. And we're going to get into this. Again, a hooroo. Peace to everybody that's viewing, like, and share. I'm going to try to look at the chat as I'm going through this as well to see if there's any questions or comments. But I'm going to really just focus on this information. So Blueprint for Black Power, this is an overview of chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 1, the title of chapter 1 is What is Power? And this is setting the stage for the rest of this book, because this is the overarching theme of what's being spoken about in this book, power, and the lack thereof in the African community in relation to the European community and other communities that come into the African community attempting to oppress and exploit African people, because we see other groups also getting in on the oppression and exploitation of African people. And even within the African nation, we have people who tend to become neo-colonialists and work in the interests of European powers. So we have all of these contending forces that we have to deal with. And so we have to be knowledgeable about what needs to be done to overturn these contradictions. And so, yes, the overarching theme of this book is power. And Dr. Wilson, he starts off talking about the nature of power. And he really, he makes a great, from the very beginning, he makes it clear that he's not here just to define what power is, because power can show up in many ways. So he wants to look at the different types of power. So Dr. Wilson says power comes with being, with interactive existence, with being alive. It is the essence of life and a motive force of growth and development, and of the adaptability of living things to environmental changes, and demands. Right? And he says to be powerless is to be willless, impotent and lifeless, without effect or influence, to be nothing of no account. All right. And then the last point I want to make is he says power is essential to our existence and the most influential factor in determining our quality of life. So again, just going to this nature of power, everybody exercises power. To be alive is to exercise power, to get out of your bed, to leave your home, go for a walk, go to work, wherever you're going. Just any movement that we make, we're exercising power. But there's power relations that we're talking about. It's this power dynamic that Dr. Wilson is really getting at in this book. And we're talking about this power dynamic, because this power dynamic, there has to be a struggle, a relationship, in order for there to be some power being exercised, whether it's an internal struggle or external struggle, right? And we're talking about, for the most part, a struggle between groups, a struggle between nations, right? But right here, again, we're talking about power. It's just in the simplest form, power is just this exercise being, right? So he goes on to say the unimpeded intentionality of living systems, including especially human beings, is self-realization, self-actualization, the fulfillment of genetic potential or possibilities, right? And when you're conscious of not being able to fulfill those your genetic potential or possibilities, or to attain self-realization, when you feel like there's something holding you back from achieving that, there's a struggle that begins to, so you begin to resist. You begin to resist whatever force, whether physical force, material force, or idealistic, forces such as thoughts, because there could be ideas and thoughts that keep you from doing the necessary action, committing the necessary action to be able to attain self-actualization, self-realization. So we have mental, struggles, right? Psychological struggles within ourselves. And we struggle against individuals and we struggle against groups, right? And when we don't struggle, it's particularly, and then if we don't have the power to realize these things, and if we don't struggle to attain these things, more than likely then you're being influenced or manipulated or forced not to attain or achieve the things that all people want, which is self-determination. And so there's a point in Dr. Wilson laying all of these things out, because we have to be very conscious of what power we have and what power we are lacking, right? And how much power we have in relations to other individuals or groups, right? And their ability to exercise power over us, and the power to have us do things in their interests and against our own interests. All right. So in this next slide, the necessity of power, Dr. Wilson, he talks about there are many blacks who have, let me move this out the way. All right. There are many blacks who have been convinced by racist propaganda that supreme power is divinely, there are many blacks who have been convinced by racist propaganda that supreme power is divinely deeded to dominant whites. More unfortunate is the self-abnegating perception by many blacks that they are inherently incapable of mounting a successful campaign against oppressive white power, and therefore must sulkily seek the least onerous accommodation to it. Isn't this what we are really dealing with? And it's not just a minority when we think about it. Unfortunately, the masses of people have adopted this idea, but the masses of people, they choose different paths on how they're going to live under the system of white domination, political and economic domination, which I'll get to in a second. Dr. Wilson also says we must be ever conscious of the fact that the establishment, whatever rewards it gives us, will also, if necessary to maintain its control, kill us, which is important as well. And I'm going to tie all that together. That last point is important because when we go to the first two points, of course it's important because we're talking about a group of people who can essentially wipe you out, can exterminate you if and you don't have the capacity to be able to defend yourself from genocidal actions or the act of one group attempting to annihilate you and everyone else that's a part of your group. Genocide in a sense, right? So we're in a situation though that people aren't even conscious of that or even thinking about that constantly. This because we should be in a state of urgency. We should be thinking with a state of urgency and moving with a state of urgency if we're conscious to this fact. The establishment, whatever rewards it gives us, whatever plaques, whatever Nobel Peace Prize, whatever, resources, aid, what all of that, whatever it gives us, if necessary to maintain its control, it will kill us. It will wipe us out if it felt like it would lose grip of the power and control that it has over other people in the world. Now, going back to these first 2 points, there are many blacks who are convinced by racist propaganda that the supreme power is divinely deeded to the dominant whites, whether, spiritually, but in the abstract sense, in the theological sense, we could talk about spiritually and so forth. But people, in a real sense, though, people really think that the system, the way that it's been constructed, or the society, the way that it is, the reality that we deal with every day, it cannot be modified. It cannot be changed. That a revolution is sort of, anybody who's talking about revolution is sort of delusional, right? And it's this type of thinking that there's no way that we can go against a system of white political economic domination. And then the domination that's coming from other groups within our communities, which is part of the system, we can't overturn that. And so what happens is we seek for ways to survive within the system rather than organize for revolution or organize for our own liberation, right? So we accommodate, this system by going to work for their corporations, going to their universities and getting degrees. And I'm not saying like do not do these things, but we do it with the objective of being able to move up within the system of colonialism and not using these institutions to be able to empower ourselves to actually dismantle the system, right? Like, how do we break the system down within? And that's only one front. There has to be other fronts that go with it, right? And how do we get these resources and be able to, hey, take these resources and bring it back to the community and build dual and contending power? As Chairman Amali Yeshitela always says, dual and contending power. We're building dual and contending power, right? So these are some things to think about. Yeah, I see you going in in the chat. And Dada Nduku, and says, in a way, he has structured the organization to have an arm made up of white people who are in solidarity with black people realizing Uhuru for the colonial systems. Right on, yeah. And now I need to see this. Now that I need to change my thinking and strategy if we are to win. Right on. Yeah, that's what it's about. It's about developing strategies to win. That's a key thing, developing strategies to win. Sometimes we get so caught up in our own personal feelings about something that we keep ourselves from being a part of the overall strategy to overturn this relationship that we have with people who are dominating us. We have to, and Dr. Wilson is really getting into this in this first chapter when he's talking about the typologies of power, because when we're talking about force, manipulation, I'm gonna get to it, force, manipulation, influence, and so forth. There's certain things that we will not do within the group among African people that we won't do and we should not do, right? When we come into consciousness, revolutionary consciousness, that we may have to adopt as a strategy when we're working with other people. And I'll just leave it at that. I won't say no more. The typology of power: force as power, coercion as power, influence as power, competent and legitimate authority as power, manipulation as power. These are just some of the forms of power or types of power that Dr. Wilson is going to touch on in this book. But there's also other types of power as well. Now, as we go through these types of power, we have to be conscious of this is how power is being used against us, and this is also, power that we might have to adopt and exercise in order for us to liberate ourselves and be a self-determined people, right? And these are types of power that we're not exempt from using or applying these types of power as well, but there's levels to it, right? We may exercise force within our home, right? We may exercise manipulation among our friends or associates and so forth, which we shouldn't do, right? But I'm just saying that exists. People exercise these types of power, whether in a positive or negative way, among individuals. But when we're talking about groups, when we're talking about nations, dealing with nations, African people have been struggling to be able to use these types of power against the colonizers, and against other groups who are more organized than we are, who's able to come in our community and oppress and exploit African people or within our countries, right? So force is power. Power as force involves the exercise of biological and physical means to prevent another person or group from doing what he or it prefers to do, or to get something to happen to the person or group that he or it would prefer it did not. Wouldn't the masses of African people who are working from check to check, or who are working in mines digging for gold, diamonds, wouldn't they like to see more resources for their labor than they are receiving, for what they're producing, the things that they are producing, whether it's cocoa, right? chocolate, cocoa or vanilla. These are grain. The things that they are producing, wouldn't they like to see more resource? So why do they not say anything, or why do they not discontinue the relationship with those people who are not giving them the resources that they need to survive within society? It's because the state has this monopoly of force, right? It has this monopoly of force. The colonizer has this monopoly of force. And if you try to change this colonial relationship, right, and you try to develop a relationship on your terms, then they will use that force to be able to put you back in your place. This is going back to what Dr. Wilson said earlier in the slide that I had, speaking about the system. Whatever rewards it gives you, in order for it to survive, if necessary, it will kill you. They will take you out, right? So we have to strip them of this monopoly of force, and we have to, and ways to do that is get organized and to capture the state. Capture the state. On the continent, they're in the best position to be able to capture the state, right? Because you're talking about African people who are in positions of power within the state. But the only problem is there's an ideological difference. These are people who are ideologically aligned, politically, economically aligned with foreigners, with colonizers, with people who are outside of Africa, who are dictating policy and so forth within the continent. And then when you go outside of Africa in places where you have Africans who represent a numerical minority, it's a lot more difficult to capture the state, right? Africans capturing the state in Britain, right, is going to be a whole lot more difficult than Africans in Jamaica, right, that's capturing the state. So places that that we are predominantly the population, it's a lot easier for us to capture the state. But this is what has to be done, because this is what puts the European at an advantage. You know, they not only control the state, but they have this monopoly of force, and they have people who are working within African societies who have captured the state, but are working against the interests of African people. So I hope all this makes sense. It's not just a bunch of words, but I'm just trying to make it as clear as possible. Force is power. Force may be used instrumentally rather than directly to achieve certain ends. The instrumental use of force, which is important, right? So, you know, because force, when somebody's using force, it's difficult for me to force you to eat food, like physically force you to eat food, right? Or physically to work. It's difficult for me to force. Like, it can be done, right? Like I can, and it has been done, right? You can whip a person, beat a person into submission and have them do something, right? But to continue to do this is ineffective, because the person who is being forced to do something is conscious that he's being forced to do something against his will, that he's being pushed to do something, a move to do something that he doesn't want to do. And so there's going to be a whole lot of anger. There's going to be a whole lot of hostility towards the person who is forcing them to do what they're doing. And so that person is one day going to want to rise up and overturn the system that is committing these acts of brutality, aggression, and force against them. So force may be used instrumentally rather than directly to achieve certain ends, because instrumental use of force may be more efficient than, depending on how it's used, more efficient than this physical use of force. So the instrumental use of force may involve its use to inhibit or destroy another person's or a group's ability to develop and mobilize his or its human and material resources, which might be used against the interests of the powers that be. The strategic or tactical purpose of instrumental force is to limit or eliminate the subordinate individuals or groups' capacity to act in certain ways. And you see, I have here laws and rules as examples of instrumental uses of force, right? And then when you accept those laws and rules, right, it becomes legitimate. Like it legitimates that use of force. But there's just these restrictions that are placed on people through rules. Jim Crow, for instance, segregation. Like these was rules, whether it was de facto, or de jure. Um, they prevented people from being able to do certain things like vote or exercise quote unquote constitutional rights that they had. Right, they had these laws on the books, but there was another set of rules for African people in this country to prevent them from doing certain things, and this can help shape behavior where you don't have to use this physical force. But then what? We always have people who will go against the grain, who's conscious, whether you don't have to punch a person in the face and tell them not to do something, right? For them to understand that they're being forced not to behave in a certain way, right? Or to be free, to exercise their freedom. They can understand and be conscious of, hold on, these rules and laws are unjust. I should be able to do these things. But then when you go against those rules and laws, what happens? They have the monopoly of force, so they can come with the police. They can come with the military. So you see how it works hand in hand? This is why we have to capture the state. This is why we have to have power and self-determination so we can prevent these things from taking place. Because once it takes place over a period of time, a certain period of time, what's going to happen? We become conditioned to act in a particular way. And we become conditioned to act in a way that services the colonizer. And it goes back to the slide. Let me go back, because all of this ties back to this right here, where there are many blacks who have been convinced to the racist propaganda that supreme power is divinely deeded to dominant whites, right? After this conditioning, hundreds of years of conditioning. More unfortunately is the self-abnegating perception by many blacks that they are inherently incapable of mounting a successful campaign. Why? Because leaders are being murdered, people are being hung, right? Organizations are being infiltrated and destroyed, right? So they become inherently incapable. They believe they're inherently incapable of mounting a successful campaign against oppressive white power, and therefore most openly seek the least onerous accommodation to it. You see how it all ties? How it all makes sense, right? So force as inefficient power. Force is more effective in preventing or restricting people from acting than in causing them to act in a given way. Maintaining the use of force requires constant expenditures of energy by the dominant agent, as I just alluded to. Force is also uneconomic because it inherently occasions resistance. So I touched on these points, so I'm going to keep going. White imperialism, the ability to use physical / militaristic force as the final arbiter of power relations still lies overwhelmingly in the hands of Europeans and Euro-Americans. It is this force differential that Africans across the diaspora must in some way resolve, neutralize, or frustrate if they are to gain true parity with Europeans and Euro-Americans and indeed gain their liberation from European domination. All right. So y'all can tell that I've been studying this book, because I've just been covering it. I basically touched on these last couple of slides. So I'm going to keep going. But I do read and study this book. I have been studying this book for a few years, for several years now. And give me 1 second. I did something where I put the caption up here. I don't want to see myself. All right, I think I took it off. All right. But that would be good for people who are hearing impaired, right? So I'll keep that. I'll be conscious of that. I may go back to that at some point. So psychic violence, psychic or psychological violence is the manipulative stance people take in order to prevail in a conversation. These are definitions that Dr. Wilson doesn't touch on these definitions of the book, but I thought it would be important to uplift these definitions. So I wanted to highlight this. So again, psychic or psychological violence is the manipulative stance people take in order to prevail in a conversation. Right? any intentional conduct that seriously impairs another person's psychological integrity through coercion or threats, right? Any act that causes psychological harm to an individual. This occurs when we can get others to submit to our views of things, that identify with us, that pulls their energy into us, and we feel stronger. You ever hear, somebody say, "Stop gaslighting"? Are you gaslighting me? I think that's probably one of the best examples, man, because everybody's probably familiar with that. Use of psychic violence, right? Someone who is threatening you if you don't do a certain thing, if you don't behave in a particular way, right? And the threat and what backs up the psychic violence, again, going back to this monopoly of force, or someone who may be bigger and stronger than you, and they're intimidating you, or someone who may have a weapon or act like they have a weapon, right? Somebody comes up to you and say, "Hey, you don't do what I tell you to do, I'm going to stab you." They might not even have a knife, right? Or somebody who's constantly bullying you. So all these different tactics that can be used by somebody that can cause harm to a person psychologically. The police itself, when you see the police in your community, a car is riding through, or police on corners, right? And for some people, that might be okay. Like, yeah, we need the police in the community. But for others, that may be traumatic because of what the police may stand for to them, what they represent, or the things that they have done over decades, over centuries, to African people or other oppressed people, right? So their very presence can cause psychological harm, psychic violence, and that's the intention. That's the intention of using physical force, and then not having to use it anymore, but just having that threat, so you can get people to do. And this is going back to, again, with the other slide, where you have Africans who are living under constant terror, or constant oppression and exploitation, who are not rising up against the apparatus who is causing the suffering and pain and the poverty, right? They don't stand up against this threat, or this apparatus, because of this fear of what may take place. This is the result of psychic violence. You probably somebody may have never even experienced, many of us never experienced, well, none of us experienced Jim Crow. Let's say that. I'm going to say that. We may have experienced racism and so forth, but or somebody even may have attacked us because of us being African or non-white. But we never experienced slavery, right? Chattel slavery, or the Jim Crow era, just saying in the South. For many like Africans who may be living through the post-colonial stage, never lived under a colonial domination, right? Direct colonial domination, but still have this fear of the people who committed those acts, the group that committed those acts, because of what they've been told, or what they've read, or what they've seen through the media, right? It's just this idea that white people are quote unquote supreme, right? Or white people have all of this power, right? And it's the interesting thing is they represent a minority. Maybe 10% of the world's population is white. How do they are able to control 90% of the world? Through psychic violence, of course, through physical means too, when necessary. But I'll go to this next slide. Psychic violence as for, and psyops is another example right there. The most powerful obstacle against the liberation of African peoples from white domination and exploitation is not the ability of whites to use superior military or police firepower, or their threat to use it against African insurgency, but it's their ability to engage in unrelenting psychological violence against the collective African psyche. Who was saying, I remember hearing a story about in Vietnam what the U.S. military used to do. I can't remember who was telling the story, but the story goes that the U.S. military would drop bombs. They would constantly be dropping bombs, and they wouldn't even be hitting targets. Right? They're just dropping bombs on Vietnam for this with the intention on striking fear into the minds and the hearts of the people of Vietnam, the Vietnamese, right? So even though they weren't directly sending bombs their way, just the fact that they were dropping bombs, right? That was psychological warfare. They was doing that to manipulate and to strike fear into the Vietnamese people so that they would surrender, that they will no longer want to fight, right? So, this is just another example of how psychological violence can be used. And there's other means that are used every day on African people through the media. There's through images, such as, let me go through this slide. Propaganda does hurt. Damage to the psyche is surely as real as damage to the body. It is plainly not true that sticks and stones may break my bones, but names can never hurt me. Wilson says psychic violence in which the intended effect of the perpetrator is to inflict mental or emotional harm is continuous with physical violence. Right? And so when we again go into the psychic violence, Dr. Wilson, he talks about the ultimate force in the world is the force of the mind. When that force is defeated, all is lost. What does Steve Biko say? He said the most potent weapon of the oppressor is the minds of the oppressed. The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the minds of the oppressed. Steve Biko said that, right? So this use of psychic violence, this control over the minds of the people. Dr. Bobby Wright talked about it. You control minds, you control behinds, right? And they control the institutions to be able to control our minds. They control the schools, they control the curriculum, they control the media. And then when you try to inject some sort of curriculum that will benefit African people, what will they do? They will say, hold on, this is unconstitutional, or this is teaching hate, or, there's something fundamentally wrong about people integrating a curriculum that will liberate or advance the interests of African people. So we see it in Florida, but a good example in Florida when they tried to introduce the advanced curriculum on African American studies, but we've seen this backlash for critical race theory. Which I think critical race theory is really not. That's something that white people really need. But we've been talking about an African-centered approach in education. Long before there was a critical race theory. And we need a revolutionary, center, African revolutionary center education. We need liberation schools. But the point is, these institutions, when we talk about these institutions, these are colonial institutions, the education system. So when you try to introduce something to liberate African people, you will get resistance from the status quo in this country. They have to be able to control your minds. You will not get a liberating education, a liberatory education within the colonial school system. And I'm actually doing, with that being said, I'm actually doing a talk on September 23rd. I'm doing a workshop, the Africana Studies that's being put together by Ishmael here in Philadelphia. So you can follow. Make sure you follow We Charge Colonialism on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, because I will post information for that workshop that's coming up on September 23rd. Right, we're going to talk about colonial education. So coercion is power. Coercion is the instrumental use of force or the threatened use of force by the power holder to attain the compliance of another. A coercer may succeed without possessing either the capability or the intention of using force, so long as the power subject believes he possesses both. Right? Coercion, in contrast to the use of raw force, permits the power holder to benefit more readily from the subordinate subject's actions and reactions. Coercion and psychic, violence is very much related, right? But to coerce somebody to do something, you can see in this picture right here, my man's holding a water gun to his head. He doesn't know that he has a water gun, right? But it's this belief that the perpetrator of this force or the one who's trying to exercise power over you, that they have capabilities that they don't have, is enough to be able to coerce you or to get you to do something that you wouldn't do otherwise. We see it every day with African people doing things despite their conditions. They continue to act and behave in a way that's not in the interest of themselves. Like you're working, going to school, you're doing all of these things in the interest of maybe your personal, individually. You think, okay, I'm trying to come up within this society, right? But we find ourselves on a hamster wheel when we're doing that, right? And also, it doesn't do anything for the collective of African people. And this is why we see African communities across the world begin to deteriorate, because African people who do reach a certain status within the society want to escape from the community from which they are from. They want to escape from their neighbors, from their friends, from their family, because they're not on the level, I guess, that they are on. They're not moving the way that they are moving, right? So it becomes this very individualistic pursuit of achievement within the colonial enterprise. And all this do is help sustain colonialism. It helps sustain the relationship, because the colonizer can handle a minority of you. They can handle one of you, right? They can't handle the masses of you moving in accord. They can't handle masses of you beginning to develop and advance economically and politically and wanting to do for self. But one of you wanting to do for self isn't going to do anything to overturn the system. As a matter of fact, they'll invite you in, because it ain't going to change the texture or the color, of the system, right? So coercion is important. Influence is another form of power. Influence is power. Let me see if anybody any questions. Somebody sounds like Pavlov's theory, classical conditioning. Yep, y'all have heard about the dog responding to the bell for meals. I'm gonna take it even further in a second. Watch. Remember that. I just read that the dog. I'm gonna give you another example. Dr. Wilson talks about this in his lectures and in some of his books. Yes. Peace. Hoodoo, Black Power, everybody. Make sure you like and share too, because I'm gonna go in. I'm gonna go in. I'm gonna go through this chapter 1, and again, I'm gonna go and finish up chapter 2 today, and then when we come back next Tuesday, we're gonna move into chapter 3. And I'm gonna give you a heads up. Chapter 3 is social and cultural origins of power. So communism, socialism, Marxism is useless because these are taught in American college system. Yeah. I'm gonna say, like, there's theories and ideas across the board, I think, that may have some usefulness. And Dr. Emerson Wilson talks about this too. Dr. Wilson, he gives a huge critique of communism and socialism, right? Because his problem is people who become religious about it. But he says that they can be useful, talking about these ideas and concepts. Now, as far as the way that we move, though, I think we do have to move collectively, right? But there is a European development of socialist ideas, communist ideas, where they were examining, and I don't want to go too far, I'm gonna go right back to this, but they were examining Europeans, and they were coming with a European perspective, right? And so there's going to have to be the development of ideas from an African perspective. I'm an African internationalist. Chairman Omali Yeshatellis gave us the theory of African internationalism, right? And so we have a view of the world that is rooted in the African experience. And when Europe came to Africa, when they came to the Americas, what that meant for African people and how we developed through this social system as a result of that, looking at it through that lens, you're going to have a different approach and develop different strategies for solving the problem than someone who is looking at the issue of African people through the lens of Europeans. Because what happens, I'm going to digress a bit. Actually, in class, I had my students look at two articles. An article by Du Bois, where Du Bois is talking about the Negro problem. This article was written, I think, in the 1890s. And then there's a guy by the name of Nathaniel Schaller. And you should take a look at Nathaniel Schaller and what he's saying about African people and his critique. And he's talking about the Negro problem. But these two people have different ideas on what the Negro problem is. Du Bois is talking about the structure, the social structures being the Negro problem. I do have a critique with Du Bois because Du Bois does want us to, he feels as though that we can advance and integrate into this society. That's the objective. But the reason we're not able to do it, and there's a problem, is because the system isn't allowing us to do it. Like that's the problem. But he doesn't see an issue with the development of the colonial capitalist society. It's just that we don't have an equal opportunity to be a part of the society. I say we have to dismantle the society and get away from it. But the other point is like Nathaniel Schaller, when he's talking about the Negro problem is that the Negro problem in America is the fact that the Negroes are descendants from African people. African people have never risen above barbarism. They're heathens, uncivilized. This is what Nathaniel Schaller is saying. So the American Negro, he's never had an opportunity to advance and beyond that because he just came out of slavery. So if anything, slavery only stagnated the African. And then after slavery, there's this fear that the African is now going to revert back. The African American will revert back to the ways of the African on the continent. It's very interesting stuff when you read it. But one thing Nathaniel Schaller also said, he said that Africans have a problem with coming together, organizing, and working with each other. This is in the 1890s. He says that we have a problem with work, and this is deep to talk about because I can critique that all day as well. But you can see that we do have some issues today among Africans of organizing, but I don't think it's a fault of our own, though. You know, we have to overcome it. We are our own liberators, so we're gonna have to solve the problem. But there's the colonizer has systematically indoctrinate us to the point where we are at that point where it's difficult for us to build that trust and so forth. But that's a whole nother conversation. But the point is, he said that we can't do this. He said we never created any empires and so forth. And I'm like, see, this is the type of manipulation that can take place, you know, when you have these races who are in positions of power, who are making these statements when, I mean, he didn't know about the empires of Ghana, the Songhai Empire, the Mali Empire, right? The great city of Zimbabwe, right? Or Kush, right? The Moors. I mean, we can go on and on about city states, the Masi states or kingdoms, right? The Homie. And the point is like, he's making this point of us not being able to do these things, but there's a long history of that. And so now we become ignorant and believe this, and we move in a way that, and then we don't move in a way that will liberate or advance African people, because from the perspective of Africans, because we feel like we've never done anything. I was in a class in the classroom. My students teaching American history, students say, you know, the only thing they don't like American history, only thing they know about Black people is slavery. That's the only thing that they was taught. Whole nother conversation. So influence is power. They write books about this, how to win friends and influence. They write books about how to attain power. All of this. What is it? Seven highly effective ways to win friends and influence is another book, right? I think something like that. Influence occurs when a person acts in compliance with his wishes or directions or suggestions of another, or with the compliance with the wishes or directions of or suggestions of another. Excuse me, based on his shared positive regard for love and admiration of the other, or based on a desire to please or serve the other because of the other's personal significance to him. Influence is the power or capacity of causing an effect in indirect or intangible ways. The act of power of producing an effect without apparent exertion of force or direct exercise of command. All right. And Dr. Wilson, I think it's important that we highlight this. And I think that he wanted to highlight this because this is where we are at now. We're in sort of an age where everybody is looking for this type of power through social media. And so this is a very effective means of really getting people to do what you want them to do. This sort of like status symbol, people, you know, once they reach a particular status within this society, whether it's they got a lot of followers on social media, or they have this kind of job or this degree, right? A master's degree, a doctor's degree, a lawyer, right? You know, these people are able to exercise type of influence in vocabulary, or you know, when we think people have a certain amount of intelligence, we treat people differently. We're more. This is why this is something that I do. Maybe I shouldn't. I don't know. But I don't like to tell people what it is that I do for a living. You know, I don't like to reveal too much information about me because I like to see how a person will treat you. You know, just knowing that, hey, I'm just a person just like you. You know, forget all the status, forget everything else that comes with you being a person, because everybody has status and roles, right, that we occupy within a society. But forget all of that. You know, would you treat me if I was a janitor? If I was someone who taught at a university, or I was someone who was a CEO of a corporation, no matter what my status is, will you treat me the same? And that's a whole nother conversation. But influence, again, like influence within a society, this is something that the colonizer has been able to capture too, right? They are able to have this influence because we think that they're more powerful than they really are, but they were able to put themselves in a position, and they've been able to use propaganda through the media. This is why their control of the media is so important. Them being able to control the images through the media, where they're able to break the African down to a level where the African doesn't have the same type of influence of being African than a person who may be European, or a person who may be Indian or Chinese, right? Depending on where you are. These are people who are able to exercise more influence through their identity, because of their identity, because of the way that the media has portrayed certain groups of people. So this is why a person with an American passport can go to places, right, and be treated a certain way because of a certain status that they have being American. At least this is what they tell me, right? say you go with an American passport, you can basically do, you get so much respect and so forth wherever you go around the world. But that status can begin to change. That status is not permanent, right? But that has to do with who controls the media and who controls the narrative. But again, going back to the influence, very important. Another very important type of power. So types of influence that Dr. Wilson talks about: rational persuasion, personal persuasion, expertise, competent authority, propagandistic persuasion. So when we look at rational persuasion, in this instance, the subject retains the use of his critical or rational faculties, but is led to reassess his understanding or perception of a situation or of reality, or to accept as reasonable or correct the conclusions reached and recommendations suggested by the other as a result of the other's apparently logical argumentation or reasoning, which comes from who the person is, the type of influence that they have. Because you're not just going, and this again, you're being rational in a sense, in regards to accepting the argument or accepting what is being asked from you from another person. But that acceptance is based on the way that you perceive this person, the type of influence this person has on you. So in a sense, I was almost irrational, but I get what he's saying with the rational. But the personal persuasion, which is a bit more irrational, in this instance, the subject's behavioral compliance, the argumentation or demands of the other occur essentially because he wishes to satisfy the desires of the other as he perceives them to exist, right? Now this is irrational compared to the other one, because you still have your faculties, you still think logically, but what it is that the person who is making art, for instance, like a person who has a doctor's degree in philosophy, if they're making an argument to you and telling you to do it, they could be completely wrong, but they're persuasive and have influence over you because of the status they have as a doctorate in philosophy, a doctor in philosophy, or biology and so forth. But in the other instance, I don't necessarily have to have all of that. In this instance, the subject's behavioral compliance, the argumentation or demands of the other occur essentially because he just wishes to satisfy the desires of the other as he perceives them to exist. The expertise and competent authority, though, this is a person who's in a position of authority. I mentioned, let's just say a teacher-student relationship, or a police officer, or a judge. These people, because of their expertise and competence, quote-unquote competence, in their field, can exercise authority over others. This is right here, this point right here, I want to make this point. The judge has this expertise or has this competent authority. You say a judge because of what they studied, right? And their expertise in law. And of course, they went through school and study, and the lawyer as well, right? We wouldn't dare argue with these lawyers, but they're competent. They have this authority because they have studied the knowledge within the system that is still working against our interests. The only reason I guess the point I'm making, the only reason that they have that authority and competence, and we recognize it, is because we agree with the rules. If we agree with the judicial system, then we agree with those people who have positions within the judicial system, such as the lawyer or judge. And even if we don't disagree, we still participate, and we still accommodate them. We still, and of course, like, this comes with the force and everything. But the point is like, we don't do anything to overturn it, right? Because of fear or whatever. So this is the reason why they have the authority that they do have. But in a system, if we had a system, we set up our own rules. A lawyer within our system doesn't have no authority. The judge within our system doesn't have any authority. As a matter of fact, you are incompetent because you don't know the rules that we have developed and created. So that's kind of the point I was trying to make. Hopefully that makes sense. Propagandistic persuasion through various media and forms of indoctrination techniques. The subject is influenced to accept certain opinions or beliefs which led him to think that he is acting in his own interest when this really is not the case. These are some points that I had touched on already. The Oz effect, I think, is a good example. Dr. Wilson touches on this in another chapter as well. But this idea that this person has power, that this person has a particular status, and the Oz, just think about the Wizard of Oz. These people wanted to go see the great Wizard of Oz because people was chatting, talking about how powerful the wizard is. And if anybody can solve your problem, it's the wizard, right? So the wizard, which we find out in the end, didn't have any of the power that he had and wasn't even probably physically able to do anything to these people. And probably, you know, in regards to intelligence and so forth, that's a whole nother conversation. But he basically wasn't the person that he was led out to be by other people. So when they went to the wizard, though, not knowing this information, there was all this deference that they were given to the wizard. You know, the wizard, the great and powerful Wizard of Oz, and they was expecting the wizard to be able to help them in their endeavors. And what did the wizard do? The wizard said he sent them on a mission to go. What was it? If I can remember, I think to kill the witch or to do something, right? But he sent them on a dummy mission to handle the wizard's business, right? The wizard didn't even have to handle. He was able to get someone else to do it. And this is what the colonizer does. The colonizer is able to get us to do all of the work and all of the dirt for him because we think that they're all powerful, right? But influence's power involves the power holder's ability to gain his subordinate subjects' voluntary acceptance of and behavioral compliance with the power holder's interpretation of reality. With the power holder's interpretation of reality, value judgments, prescriptive suggestions, and commands based on the power holder's perceived status, resources, personal social attributes, competence, expertise, or legitimate authority, right? And I said that in 2 times, I'm going to say it 3 times. Interpretations of reality, right? Compliance with the way that they are interpreting reality, the way that they interpret laws and rules. If they created it, it's easy for them to interpret. We struggle to try to interpretate the rules and the laws within their system, right? We try to look for loopholes within a reality that they created rather than create our own reality. This is what we have to do to get free. We have to build our own institutions. We have to develop our own society in a way that we interact with each other. This is the first step, I think, on the path to self-determination and power. When we begin to do those things, we're beginning to exercise those things, right? But until we are completely separated from the colonizing, from the colonial system, we'll still have to contend with these colonizers. So consequently, they convinced or persuade many blacks to behave in ways compatible with maintaining white power. Okay. Consequently, they convince or persuade many blacks to behave in ways compatible with maintaining white power and compatible with generating black power. This situation devolves from blacks having accepted Eurocentric frames of reference and perceptions of reality. So competent and legitimate authority is power, which I just sort of touched on. So I'm just going to read through this and go to the next slide. Competent authority involves the achievement and exercise of social power derived from knowledge and skill, and where behavioral compliance is obtained from the subject in return for his receipt of some benefit or service awarded by the authority. Competent authority is authority that rests solely on the subject's belief in the superior knowledge or skill of the exerciser rather than a formal position in a recognized hierarchy of authority. Competent authority or expertise may crucially be used as a mask for social privilege and power exercised by one group over another. It hides social privilege and power because it appears to merely exist to advance the public interest. I hope that's clear. I'm gonna keep moving though. Legitimate authority refers to a power relation. If there's a question about something too, put it in the chat because I'll address it. But I got a bunch of slides, so I'm gonna try to go through some of these a lot quicker. Legitimate authority refers to a power relation in which the power holder possesses an acknowledged right to command and the subject an acknowledged obligation to obey. And again, we've been kind of touching on these because these different types of power too, you can see how they intersect or overlap, right? When we talk about force, psychic violence, coercion, legitimate authority, competent authority, there's some overlapping and intersecting, and they, are a lot of times you'll see these different types of power being showing up at once. So again, refers to a power relation in which the power holder possesses an acknowledged right to command and the subject an acknowledged obligation to obey. Manipulation is power. Manipulation involves the attempt by the manipulator to elicit certain desired responses from his subject while concealing his efforts to do so. You see, I got this picture of somebody winding up like this person. This is what the manipulator does. It just winds us up. Or what we say, put a battery in somebody's back. Put a battery in them back and have them, do something that they wasn't even thinking about or wanting to do, right? That's what back in the day when people are arguing and you had somebody trying to instigate and get them to fight, right? Trying to manipulate a situation. Colonizers do this all the time. I'm going to tie this back into what was it? I think I was talking about, was it coercion as power? Coercion? No, it was a different form of power. But the manipulation. But when you manipulate in people's environments, it was with force. What was it? Instrumental use of power. That's what it was. Instrumental use of power. Because I talked about laws and rules, but also when you are able to have people live in a certain community, pushing people to live in a certain place. That right there is instrumental use of power. Like geography is important. There's a book that I have somewhere that's called The Power of Place. The Power of Place. And there's another book called Divided Communities. Got here somewhere. I got it right here. There we go. There we go. This book right here. If y'all probably can't see that, but The Power of Place, Geography, Destiny, and Globalization's Rough Landscape. Right. This is by Harm Day Blige. And there's another book called Divided Cities, Belfast, Beirut, Jerusalem, Mostar, and Nicosia. This is by John Kalane and Esther Charlesworth. And the reasons why I bring this book up, because just going back to this instrumental use of power that I was talking about, and also manipulation, because you can manipulate where people live in your own interest, and people living in a certain place, is power placed by the cities, can determine where they're going to end up in life, right? So instrumental use of power can be not putting resources into a certain community. Redlining, right? We've heard of redlining where the banks would draw this red line around a certain community or district, and these people will be considered high risk. These African people or people of African descent, or the Latino community, who was dealing with redlining, because there were other communities dealing with it too, right? Again, this is that instrumental use of force, and this can also be used as manipulation, when you can manipulate a person's behavior or manipulate a person's environment. That's power. And our sister Nduko, you were talking about the dog, and I'm gonna get to this other example as well to make this even more clear. So manipulation involves the attempt by the manipulator to elicit certain desired responses from his subject while concealing his efforts to do so. Commonly, manipulation is achieved by skillfully presenting information what we going to teach your children, what we are not going to teach your children. These are political decisions. Down in Florida, when they told them no, that African American events, no, take that back. Y'all gonna have to modify that. You guys gonna have to make some edits before we accept that. Y'all not teaching this, right? But the mere fact that they had the power to do that is a problem, and that's whether we agree with the curriculum. There may be some things we wanted to change in it, but it didn't even cross our table. The Black community didn't even have the opportunity to say, hey, we don't even accept this, right? It was presented and shot down. But commonly, manipulation is achieved by skillfully presenting information through the media, the news, rewards and deprivations in ways which shape information. Skillfully presenting information, rewards and deprivations in ways which shape the consciousness and behavior of the subject and motivates him to freely choose to act in ways compatible with the concealed intentions of his manipulator. All right. So you better act a particular way or you won't be able to get this job. You better dress a certain way, talk a certain way. And even the deprivation of certain things when you don't get certain resources because of the way that you act. This happens within the family, right? The family unit. But what happens when you have a group of people who don't have your interests at heart are able to exercise this type of power over you? That becomes a problem. Carter G. Woodson, when you control a man, see, I'm tying this into the manipulation. When you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. You do not have to tell him not to stand here or go yonder. He will find his proper place and will stay in it. You do not need to send him to the back door. He will go without being told. In fact, if there is no back door, he will cut one for a special benefit. His education make it necessary. This is the type of, this is scary in a sense when you think about this is what's happening to my children when I send them to these colonial schools. This is what's been happening for decades. Whether you on the continent, whether you in Jamaica, Barbados, or United States of America, Europe, African people go through a school system that was developed, created by the colonizer. It'll never be that type of education will never equip you with the tools to be able to overturn colonialism, to be able to liberate yourselves from this power dynamic, from this relationship of oppressor and oppressed. So this is the example. Dr. Wilson, he talks about the rat in the cage, right? And African people under the system of colonialism is like rats in the cage. I didn't prepare myself to bring this. I didn't prepare myself to bring this article up, but going back to Nathaniel Schaller, and I wish I had the page number. I don't want to waste time like scrolling through it. Save it for another talk. But Schaller talks about Africans in America being an experiment. He said this is an experiment. This sort of thing has never been done before, and basically, it's the European has the opportunity to shape and mold the African, because the experiment is to get for the European, the experiment was to get the African to become European, to become American, to become full-fledged citizens, is what Schaller was talking about, right? And so I read this. Power holders may exercise concealed control over the power subject through symbolic communications designed to make veiled subjects, to limit or determine selectively the power subject's information supply, or to inculcate without appearing to do so certain positive or negative attitudes. Where A alters B's environment in such a way as to evoke a desired response from B without interacting directly with B at all. How deep is this? So again, going back to Dr. Wilson, he talks about the rat in the cage, and he talks about the two students who are studying B.F. Skinner. And I'm going to talk about Skinner a little bit more. But there's two students, an African student and a European student, who's studying B.F. Skinner's experiment with the rat in the cage, should not be studying the rat the same way because their experiences are different. The European who's studying the rat in the cage is looking at it from the standpoint of being the person who's able to manipulate the environment of the rat to get them to behave in a certain way. But the African experience is a bit different than the European experience because the African isn't the colonizer. The rat is the colonized. The experimenter is the colonizer. So the African has to see himself as the colonized, the person, the rat that's in that cage that is having their environment being manipulated by the colonizer. And what does that rat need to do to get free from their colonization? It's like Nas said, right, on his album, this first album, New York State of Mind, and he's rapping. Nas at this time, he's what, 18, 19 years old when he's saying this. Nas, I would say that he's probably never, at that point in his life, read Dr. Amerson Wilson or listened to Dr. Amerson Wilson, right? This is somebody out of Queens Projects. And what did he say in that song? He said, we're like black rats trapped, plus the island is packed from all the stories what I hear when my peoples come back black. We're living where the nights is jet black. The fiends fight to get cracked. Like he's talking, he said we're like black rats trapped. He's conscious of his experience as someone colonized. And African people are conscious of being colonized. They may not have the language to call it colonialism, right? And be able to articulate it in a way that the Marxists or the African internationalists or the revolutionary is able to articulate it, but none of that really matters, right? Because they experience it and they know that there's something fundamentally wrong. But now they have to be able to develop the strategies and the answers to getting themselves out of colonialism, because many of them think that in order to free themselves or to liberate themselves, they have to become good colonial subjects and to go get a good education in these colonial schools and get a good colonial job at one of these colonial corporations and so forth, right? But this is a very important point because, again, this is what the colonizer has been able to do and continues to do: manipulate the environment, be able to reward us or take away, right? Where we have whole communities decimated, African communities decimated, and when there's billions, trillions of dollars that the state has that they can use to develop decimated African communities, they choose not to do so. But you let one of these banks be fell, one of these major banks fell, and they'll find money all over the place to be able to keep a bank from collapsing, one of these major banks from collapsing, because of this worry of what type of impact it would have on the economy, right? This is what we're dealing with. People who have the power, they basically have the power to decide whether you live or die, because these are life and death decisions that are being made. We decide not to invest this money. We know people are going to, the violence that takes place as a result of poverty, the drug use, all of these social ills and problems that result from these people living in poverty. We know it's an issue, but it's not that big of an issue where they're ready to take money, take resources, and to flood those resources into the community so that they can develop, right? It would be a contradiction for the colonizer, that is. So again, going back to manipulation, influence, media conglomerates, and we can see how resources concentrated in the hands of a few that are upholding the system of colonialism, how they're able to maintain it. These are just a few. I won't go through these, but we should be very conscious that there's only a few media conglomerates that control most of the media that we get, no matter where what we're watching, whether we're going to the movies or turning on Netflix or whatever. All of these media outlets are connected or under the control of a small group of people. So what's needed? Dr. Wilson talks about what's needed. He says a deep and fundamental transformation of the subordinated African psyche via the steadfast acquisition of an African-centered consciousness and identity will provide the socio-psychological and, if need be, military power tools for breaking through the imprisoning walls of white supremacy. The second thing he says, however, in this liberating African-centered consciousness and identity must be included an indomitable will to African power. This is what Dr. Wilson said. This will must be informed by a profound knowledge of the means of acquiring and of the exercising of power, as well as the strategic and tactical knowledge of the enemy's power. And this is what Dr. Wilson does in this book, is that he is giving us knowledge of the enemy's power, as well as what we need to do to overturn that power. This is why this book is important, right? He's giving us that insight. If we haven't studied it on our own or already, this is the book to pick up to be able to acquire that knowledge. So I'm going to transition. I know I've already gone over an hour, but I'm actually going to finish chapter 2. I'm going to do it. I'm going to keep it moving. Appreciate everybody too who's tuning in. Continue to like and share. Like and share. I just did an overview of chapter 1. I modified my approach to studying this book and examining this book. Next week, I'll be doing chapter 3, but right now I'm going to move on to basis of power, organization, and ethnic resources. Let me see what we got going on here. Yes. Appreciate y'all jumping. Yes, it is. Wizard of Oz. I could have went deeper with that one too. I'm trying to be mindful of time. And that's the thing, Dr. Wilson, when I was putting this together, these PowerPoints and selecting what I wanted to touch on, I'm telling you, every paragraph, I'm just like, oh man, we got to talk about this. It's everything Dr. Wilson touches on can be a whole podcast in itself, I feel like. But I don't want us to be here 10 years studying this, right? So I'm trying to select and highlight what I think may be the most pointed points. So coercion is the use of expressions. Together we stand. The use of expression or applied reprisal, such as discharge from employment or other intimidating behavior that puts a person in immediate fear of the consequences. Yep. And Black people that keep that ship afloat. That is a certain way to say these things. What certain way do you speak on racism other than plain, simple, or clear? Right on. Dada and Duku, you go not to have to be a professor to have an opinion. Yes, right. You don't have to be a professor to have an opinion about your living condition, the possible solutions. Right on, right? Because these are the people, it's the masses of people that are going to bring about the revolution, that's going to bring about the change that's needed, right? It's not going to be the PhDs. Dr. Wilson said, man, it was the world comes to an end. Dr. Wilson said the world comes to an end and it's destroyed. It's going to be destroyed by people with PhDs. I'm laughing, but like, point taken though. Like, it's these people who think they got all the answers, all the brains, right? And separate themselves from the masses who are making these decisions, who have been causing the downfall and will continue to cause the downfall of this world. You're true. I appreciate you. Yes. I'm about to continue to go in right now. Let me do chapter 2, and then we're going to close out. So basis of power, organization, and ethnic resources. So overview, for social power to be exercised effectively, the power holder must possess or control some important or valuable material and or social resources, which is the basis of his power. Let's keep this in mind. Resources, when used for such ends, is referred to as power bases or resources. Let's make sure that we're able to identify what power bases are so we know what we need to capture to be able to attain power. All right. If we're talking about exercising power collectively, what are our power bases? What are the things that we control that others desire, need, or want that we can use in order to empower us collectively? Right? Think about it. Make a list. Say, hey, these are the power bases that we have. Like right now, this is something that we have and we can use collectively to be able to attain more power. And if it's things that we need to attain collectively, what do we need to do to collectively to be able to attain those power bases? So social power is based or rests on social desires and needs. These are some examples of power bases or resources: physical safety, health and well-being, wealth and material possessions, jobs and means to livelihood, knowledge and social skills, social recognition, status and prestige, love, affection, social acceptability, a satisfactory self-image, and self-respect. Right. So can we see how all of these things can be? Even I talked about this in the last chapter about self-image and self-respect. I think when I was speaking about influence as power, right? So can you see how it connects and why self-image is a power base, and how African people is perceived? Africa is, oh no, it's jungle, it's disease over there. I'm not going to Africa. You don't want to go to Africa. Which going to Africa, African people going to Africa and building in Africa only will make Africa stronger. Building bridges with African people. But if there's this image of this negative image of African people, then hey, I'm not trying to do business with African people. They got to get themselves together. Right. So this is why that's a power base, right? A satisfactory self-image and self-respect. I just thought, for some reason, I just wanted to highlight that. But in this chapter, these are the power resources that he focuses on: property, organization, race consciousness, and ideology. Power, organization, race consciousness, and ideology. I cleared my throat. I'm going to just keep going, though. Thomas Dye says power is never equally distributed. There is no power. Thomas Dye is a political scientist in the 20th century. Power is never equally distributed. He said there is no power where power is equal. For power to be exercised, the power holder must control bases of power. All right. And when I began this particular study, I talked about power. There has to be this relationship, right? In order for someone to exercise power, there has to be, and that doesn't necessarily have to be with another person. We struggle with ourselves internally, right? We have power struggles with ourselves. We tell ourselves do something or not do something, right? So keeping that in mind, when we look at Africans and the relationship between Africans and Europeans and other people who are getting in on the exploitation of African people, excuse me, there's this unequal distribution of power between these groups. And these groups are able to exercise power over us because of the power bases that they have control, or the power bases that they have in their possession, right? That we do not have access to, or that we may have or are not utilizing it, right? We may be underutilizing, and we are underutilizing some of the power bases that we do have. So this is never, so our relationship as African people with Europeans, there's this unequal relationship that they control power bases, they control these institutions, they control the things we need. And this is why it's scary, because when you think about it, like what happens when they cut off the water, they cut off the electricity, what happens when they want to take this monopoly that they have on force and put us under martial law? What happens then? Are we prepared, right? What happens in a sense if they were to take all of the police out of our community? And I'm all for it too, if we're prepared to do what's necessary if the police isn't there, right? Because if they were to do that now, there would be chaos. So what are we doing to be able to go back to this this last slide? What are we this slide right here, power bases resource, what it says physical safety. What are we doing to be able to secure our physical safety, our health and well-being? Are we in a position right now to do that? We don't have this control of this power base, and so there's this dependency on the colonizer, and this is what legitimizes them every day in the eyes of people. Because you talk to people about police brutality and the need to get the police out of our communities, they're going to look at you like you're crazy, because what are you doing to be able to provide that physical safety and so forth, right? What do you have set up? So this is why we got to get organized. So racial and class domination fundamentally involves the unequal interaction between the owners of property and wealth in the propertyless and poor, right? Racial and class domination, right? Because this is what we're dealing with as African people. We're dealing with sort of like this double oppression, right? And the African woman dealing with this triple oppression. But being African, but even within the African nation, there's levels of exploitation that's going on where we're dealing with neo-colonialism. We're dealing with Africans. Look at what's going on in Equatorial Guinea, right? Where you have this despot, this person who is taking what is it? The oil, I think. If that's somebody, I think it's the oil that Equatorial Guinea has a wealth of. That he's taking. Hold on, I'm coming right back. I gotta clear my throat. I was trying to. All right. I tried. I should have known I wouldn't have been able to hold that. All right, so let me get back to this. All right, let's go. All right. So so what was I saying? So within the African community, you have people who are of a particular class who's using their position to sustain colonialism, this relationship that we have, right, with the foreigner, right, the European, who's not even indigenous to Africa, who's able to live high on the hog, or who's able to live in luxury and wealth because of the relationship that they have with African people, right? Because if you cut this relationship off with Europe and Africa, what's going to happen with Europe? All of those resources that they have, that wealth. Where are they going to get all of these resources from? I mean, they'd be able to get some from other places, but the competition, there will be all-out war going on between Europeans. I'm kind of smiling because it's sort of like a dream right now to see something like this happen, see them squabbling and fighting among each other because of the lack of resources they would have if Africa was to sever ties with them. Africa would have to restructure its economy, which would can be easily done as long as Africans are working together, because they have all of the resources they need right there. They don't even have to leave the continent. You know what I'm saying? They can be able to internally build up the economy among a billion people, and then begin to develop trade and so forth with other people. I think that they be able to do it and survive. Europe, on the other hand, I mean, they will. It was shown they will fall apart. That was the reason they left Europe in the first place, is because they had to go to other places for resources, right? That was the reason. You didn't see Africans building ships to come to the Americas or go to any other place. Though there was some trade with East Africa and Asia that was going on, right? That was taking place, but that was a mutual, relation. It wasn't no exploit. They wasn't going there to exploit and colonize people, right? Europe had to do that because they didn't have the resources. But anyway, yeah. So this racial class domination that's going on, but colonialism is the origin of it all. That's what we have to overturn. That's what we have to destroy. So look at social domination. Social domination occurs when the power of one person or group over another is exercised in a systematic manner at the expense of the dominated person or group. Domination refers not to a single exercise of power, but to a relationship between two social agents that is constituted by the existence of a power differential between them, right? Now, if you was to say that African people are not being dominated by Europe and Euro-Americans, Dr. Wilson calls them Euro-Americans, the white man of America, and not being dominated by other groups who tend to come into these communities because we're not weak enough. I mean, we're not strong enough to be able to prevent these other groups, or organized, I should say. We're not organized enough to prevent these other groups from coming into our communities and exploiting us, right? So we can admit that the relationship that we have with these other groups is one in which we are being dominated. I'm not talking about individuals within the African community, right? You could tell me, hey, we got this many millionaires, or we have this many business owners. Not trying to hear all that. I'm talking about the masses of African people, right, are being dominated by these other groups. So this should tell us that there has to be a change in the direction in what we're doing. There has to be a change in theory and ideology if you don't have one that is focusing on liberating ourselves from the relationship that we have with these other groups of people, or at least changing the terms of the relationship, right? Revolutionizing the terms of that relationship. The subordination of people of color is functional to the operation of American society as we know it, and the color of one's skin is a primary determinant of people's position in the social structure, right? But this has to do with the history, because when you go back to Africans coming in the 16th century and the 1500s, in the United States in 1619, colonial British, the English colonies, you had the first Africans being brought here in 1619, but there were Africans coming to the Americas all throughout the 1500s in the capacity of a slave. Not saying all Africans came enslaved, but this African slave trade, or this trade of enslaved Africans that took place, will create a status for African people as slaves in the society. That was the status. The status of African people was not even human. It wasn't African. It wasn't human. It was slave. And under the laws, I'm not the Constitution, but under the laws written by the colonizer, the African had the position of a slave. This is going to impact the African's position and status for centuries, all the way up until this day. The status of African people in this country is the status of colonized. Even though they don't use it, they'll use other language, and they have used other language. They said second-class citizens. They call Africans minorities. They'll use these other terms to make a distinction between the colonizer and the colonized. Property, wealth, and power. So economic power is the power to decide what will be produced, how much it will cost, how many people will be employed, what their wages will be, what the price of goods and services will be, what profits will be made, how these profits will be distributed, and how fast the economy will grow. That's economic power. In America, the foundation of economic power is private property. Real estate means the production, accumulated capitals such as factories, machinery, etc., wealth, surplus production, or material goods. Colonialism. And I probably should have had this slide before that slide, but colonialism is going back to social domination, which is the practice of domination, which involves the subjugation of one people to another. If you read any of the works of Omali Yeshitela, he talks about colonialism and this type of social domination. If you read Black Power, Kwame Ture, he also talks about internal colonialism, right? And then even if you go back to the earlier writings of Claudia Jones, Claudette Jones, right? Claudia Jones. I don't know why I said Claudia Jones. She talks about had to bring a sister in. I want to do more reading. Claudia Jones, you know, I want to put her on my like, what do you call that? Like pantheon of African thinkers, at least for me, with influence, because the people who have a tremendous amount of influence on my thinking is Malcolm X. I consider myself a Malcolmite. You know, I think X is the answer, but Malcolm X, Dr. Amerson Wilson, Chairman Omali Yeshitela of the African People's Socialist Party. I want to put Claudia Jones. I'm beginning to study more of her work because I'm thinking we can't just be reading African men thinkers. Like, where are the African women thinkers? Because they have a unique relationship as well to the system of colonialism, and it's not me separating the two, you know, because we're in this together. But what I'm saying is we have to be able to understand their experience under colonialism, which is a different experience from African men under colonialism. And there's a relationship that the European has with African women that are different with African men, that can cause a division between African men and women, and has caused a division between the two. And I think a better understanding of the experience of African women and the way that they're seeing the world will help us better be able to develop and build better relationships, and even within organizations have a better even within, when I say relationships, I was talking about relationships outside of organization, but better relationships within organization as well, right? So with that being said, though, things property versus rights property, these two forms of property. Let me see how my people are doing. Yes, soon. A number of Dr. Wilson's books should be required reading for our children. They should, and for parents, because Dr. Wilson, he has a book right here, The Awakening the Natural Genius of Black Children. Awaken the Natural Genius of Black Children. So we have books by Dr. Wilson that parents should be reading, right? Or teachers should be reading. If you're going to be teaching our children, you need to be reading that book right there. And he has a book right here, Dr. Wilson, Understanding Black Adolescent Male Violence. It's remediation and prevention. What did he say? Understanding Black adolescent male violence. Not just understanding it. He says it's remediation and prevention. We're talking about violence in the community and so forth. How come we're not studying and reading Dr. Amerson Wilson? And how come the teachers in our schools aren't talking about it? This is because we haven't exercised the power and said this is what the curriculum should have. We should have these thinkers, these books in here. And we should be building liberation schools where we don't even have to ask anybody to introduce this. We just do it ourselves, right? So there's different ways that we can go about it, but we have to exercise all of those avenues. We can't just say one way, because everybody is not going to be in full agreement, right? And everybody's not going to be able to pull their children out of the schools or want to pull their children out of the school. So what do we do with that parent that say, hey, I'm not taking my child out of the school? No. Okay, well, you're not going to take, we're going to change the curriculum then. We're going to struggle to change the curriculum. We have to be able to exercise different strategy or tactics to be able to bring our people into consciousness. So rights property may refer to stock certificates and bonds representing certain direct entitlements relating to certain things and productive activities. Thing property refers to land, houses, factories, personal items, production tools, machineries, etc. Right? So these are different types of property. And he's bringing all of this up. Dr. Wilson's bringing all of this up because he wants us to be conscious of how power is being exercised and how people are attaining this power, right? So that we can be able to, not be victims of it. And what are some things that we can use to sort of turn it against the colonizer, turn it against our enemies, the ones who are oppressing and exploiting us. So power, the significance of property relations are inextricably reflected of property relations. I'm sorry, power relations are inextricably reflected of property relations. And that has been the way this system has been designed and built from the very beginning. Those people who have property are able to exercise power over those people who do not have property. The propertyless classes and races, by the fact of their propertyless. Okay, let's do that again. The propertyless classes and races, by the fact of their propertylessness, are compelled to bow to the demands of the property as a condition for obtaining their daily bread. Get it? Who wants to be in a position like that? As African people, we should not be wanting to be in a position where we have to depend on other people because they control the institutions and resources. Dr. Bobby E. Wright, who coined menticide, he talked about the enemy, the colonizers, owning all life-sustaining institutions. Think about that. All life-sustaining institutions are controlled by the colonizers, by our enemies. So when we talk about what we need to sustain life is what? Food, water, shelter. What else we need? Food, water, shelter. These are things that we need. Like clothing, we can survive without, but in a sense, though, we need protection from the environment, certain clothes and so forth, right? But who controls those things? The enemy, the person who had enslaved us and put us in the position that we are in today. So in order for us to free, and these are power bases, in order for us to free ourselves, we have to capture those power bases. We can't be dependent on somebody else to feed us. That's insane. So the reason why I'm bringing Marx into this, the only reason I'm bringing Marx into this conversation in regards to property, because he says something that I think is important when it comes to property. Because Marx wasn't against people having property, but he makes an indictment on this social system that we are under, this colonial capitalist system that I think is important. All right. So everybody bear with me. He says the distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. He says, but the abolition of bourgeois property, hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property. Do you mean the property, he asks, do you mean the property of the petty artisan and of the small peasant, a form of property that preceded the bourgeois form? There is no need to abolish that, he says. The development of industry has to a great extent already destroyed it and is still destroying it daily. Property in its present form is based on the antagonism of capital and wage labor. So it's not this attack on property per se, like this general property of someone producing and controlling their own labor or the things that they produce. but it's the type of property that has been created under colonial capitalism, this bourgeois property that he's talking about abolishing, where you had the bourgeois able to control the means of production. Your labor is under the control. It's the property. If you work for someone, your labor and what you produce is the property of the person that you're working for. The abolition of that type of property, the abolition of the property where person can control vast amounts of, or people can control, minority people control vast amounts of land that you live on, and you have no control over the land that's under your feet. That type of property that's being talked about. But I think it's important that we also look at this social system in the same way. And that's why I say, like, there's some usefulness in the critique of the system. But the problem with looking at it through the lens of these European thinkers is that they're looking at the problems, they're looking at internal problems and how to solve those internal problems among themselves. And then they look outside at external problems and they're deciding how to solve those external problems, right, through their lens and their experience. And as African people, we need to be doing that. We need to be looking at what's happening internally among our people in our community through our own lens and developing solutions, and then looking at the external problems, which is colonialism, which is racism, which is this relationship that we have. The European, the colonizer would never say that, right? And if you are saying, and if you are adopting solutions to the African problem, where you sort of are sounding like Nathaniel Schaller, who I brought up earlier, where the Negro problem becomes a problem with us just not being more Americanized, Europeanized, or being more civilized, then you're the problem, right? No, the problem that we have always had from the beginning was colonialism, this relationship that developed from Europeans going into Africa, taking Africans and bringing them to the Americas in chains and colonizing all of Africa and the rest of the world. That's the problem. And that's why we're in the situation that we're in today. Doing content. Last thing I'll say about this particular point too, when we look at the European, I talked about internally, and this is when we're talking about capitalism and colonialism. When capitalism was developing, there was these changes, there was these rapid changes that were taking place inside and outside of the empire. And so if you notice the development of all of these fields of study in the 19th century, where history is becoming a field, sociology is becoming a field, like these weren't fields by themselves of study prior to the industrialization of Europe and America. If you go back and you look at the universities and what was being studied, like these weren't fields alone by themselves. Not saying that history and all that wasn't studied, but these became academic fields. And so the rise of these academic fields came with the industrialization and the development of capitalism. And so what's happening now is that the European he's wanting to study society. He's wanting to study the history. He wants to study behavior. All of this is happening, right, internally, and also studying what's happening outside, because there's problems. Capitalism is creating problems. And so they want to apply this science, and they need to understand the world. They need to have this control over people. They need to be able to predict behavior, be able to manipulate behavior, understand behavior, and so forth. And internally and also externally, like what's happening and within other societies. And so what they're doing is they're not indicting themselves because they see themselves developing and advancing, and not saying that colonialism is having a different impact on African people. What they're saying is something fundamentally wrong with the African people. It's not imperialism and colonialism. And so when they're developing these ideas, is rooted in that. And this is why we have to always like critique and be very conscious of who's where these theories are coming from and so forth. All right. So I know I spent a lot of time on that. Dual and contending power. Chairman Mao Yesatella talks about dual and contending power. The rapid accumulation and applied organization of property and wealth by any means necessary must become top priority goals of the African American community if it is to maximally ensure its own future survival and well-being. This is what we need to be doing. We need to be building the institutions. I talked about going into the schools and forcing a particular curriculum on the schools, but ultimately we need to be building our own schools. We need to be building our own, having control of farms to be able to feed our people. We need to have businesses and institutions that serve the interests of the African community first, right? We need to, as Garvey said, race first or nation first, the African nation first, right? And then once the nation is secure and once we're strong, okay, like what can we do over here? What can we do in these other places in regards to doing business and developing relationships with other people? But when we develop those relationships with other people, how is this going to benefit African people first? This is what other groups do. This is power politics, man, at its core. When political and economic decisions are being made by nations and corporations, they're trying to make sure that the cost of doing the cost of doing business with a certain group or nation, or the cost of going into a relationship with someone is going to be less than the benefit. If the cost is going to be more than the benefit, then they're not. What do they get into having that relationship, developing a relationship with you? So when you think that, do you think that when Europeans are developing these relationships with Africa and they want the AU to be part of G20, when they're making these decisions, do you think they're like, okay, how is this that this is going to benefit Africa more than it's going to benefit Europe? Right? Yeah, I mean, there's no such thing, I think, as this, like, this is going to be mutually beneficial, at least not equally. Somebody is going, and I know that, and that's coming from like a realist sort of perspective, but this is the type of a society that has been built under European global domination. So organizations and institutions is power resources. Power is invariably organized and transmitted through institutions, right? We've been talking about institutions. Power is invariably organized and transmitted through institutions. You're able to exercise a whole lot more power as an institution than you are as an individual. Individually, we can exercise power, right? But going up against an institution, which is of course, you're talking about a group that is highly organized, right? Going up against an institution is going to be a lot more difficult. So social organization is the interactive uniting of a number of persons into a group who, through the structured use of their aggregate resources, act to achieve the group's purposes and goals. Organized groups as collective actors controlling resources provide themselves with the capacity to exercise power over non-members, the general public, particularly clienteles, the local community, and political leaders, right? And you can see, and I'm probably, Dr. Wilson is probably, I probably have a slide for this, but this is why groups are able to come into African communities, and I'm talking about other groups are able to come into African communities and be able to exploit those communities for its resources because they're more organized. Just because you see one of a family of Koreans in the community who have a Korean store, don't think that they're not connected to a network. This organization that they have allows them to be able to exploit our communities the way that they do. From them to the Indians to the Chinese, whatever, other groups you want to name. Wrong says the more people who contribute their holdings or personal, social, and or material resources to a common pool, the greater the aggregate resources to pursue a group's goal and enhance its power likely to be. Dr. Claude Anderson, he talks about powernomics. Powernomics is basically cooperative economics. But this is a plan for Black people, though. And in his book, he gets into it. I have my critiques, but I'm not here to take time or critiquing certain things. But the point is this collective economics, I think, is the approach that is necessary in our community. And this is what Dr. Wilson is going to be touching on in these next few slides. But the more people who contribute their holdings or personal, social, or material resources to a common pool, the greater the aggregate resources to pursue a group's goal and enhance its power likely to be. Ujima, collective work and responsibility to build and maintain our community together, to make our brothers and sisters' problems our problems, and to solve them together, right? This is one of the principles of Kwanzaa, Ujima, organizations and institutions as power sources, because this is the theme right now that we're talking about. We're talking about exercising Ujima. Effective working power, essence of social power, requires the coordinated organization of power resources. The relative differences of power between peoples are largely the result of social arrangements, and the relations of power between them are typically the product of collective organization. One of the purposes of the organization of power on the part of the dominant is to ensure the relative disorganization among the subordinate. Right? I'm going to come back to that. Thus, the subordinate, through the effective social organization, may enable themselves to change the nature and outcome of the power relations between the dominant and themselves, perhaps to the extent of revolutionizing those relations. That's what we want to do. We want to revolutionize the relationship that we have with other groups of people. There has to be a revolution in that relationship. That's the only way that we will be able to liberate ourselves. Not with this current relationship. It's not sustainable, and it can't continue any longer. The longer it takes for us to change this relationship, the more unnecessary African lives are going to be lost. So this last point, when he says one of the purposes of the organization of power on the part of the dominant is to ensure the relative disorganization among the subordinate, right? In order for the dominant group to be able to maintain control over the masses of African people, it has to keep them disorganized. It has to turn one African country against another African country and support it. Yeah, you guys should invade, that country. It's going to mess up our relationship, these resources, this business that we have going on. Oh, this coup d'etat, this is going against democracy. We can't continue to support or show support to you. Right now, I'm theorizing, man, but I know I can imagine the type of conversations that are being had between Africans and Europeans about the changes that are taking place in Africa now, when things are not going in the direction or not working in the interest of Europeans, right? If there was a coup d'etat that happened in the best interest of Europe, there wouldn't be any fuss. They wouldn't care less. As a matter of fact, they will paint the person who was overthrown as someone who needed to be overthrown, needed to be taken out, right? Patrice Lumumba, come on. Patrice Lumumba, they supported the murderers of Patrice Lumumba. I don't think we don't even need to say any more about that. But the disorganization of African people, this is what's needed for them to maintain their power. Dr. Davidson Wilson says, how does a minority of the world's population control the majority? And this other book here, The Falsification of African Consciousness, Eurocentric History, Psychiatry, and the Politics of White Supremacy. He talks about it in there. But we literally, African people have to literally be out of our minds. We have to be out of body, had an out of body, out of mind experience to let a minority of people control us, right? Because as the majority, we will be saying to ourselves, hold on, like this exploitation needs to stop. Neo-colonialism, colonialism is dead, right? This is the new relationship. These are the new terms. And we was in our right mind, right? So we had to be indoctrinated. We had to be manipulated. We had to be educated to the point where the system itself is legitimized. There's this fear of going against the system. And there's this acceptance of our position within this social system. All of these things have to happen in order for them to be empowered. And I think it was when you talk about the white population being 10%, and you think about it, half of that is women. So at the end of the day, it's 5% of the population with the help of their counterpart that is dominating the rest of the world. I have to pause for a second to even think about it. So the advantage of organization imposes order and direction, or otherwise random, relatively diffuse, unfocused, or erratic phenomena. That's probably what I need. Drink some water. I'm almost finished. I'm gonna go through these last few slides, but let me clear my throat. Not used to going this long. Take a swig of some water. We're gonna go through this. Black liberation, Black empowerment, Black power B1, the hoodoo, hands off Africa, for sure. Big up. And appreciate y'all for tuning in. Make sure you like and share, subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Chapter 3 won't be as long as this. I promise you guys. I'm doing 2 chapters. I'm trying to cover 2 chapters today. Because I've been covering these 2 chapters, I think, for the last 3 months. And so, again, I'm approaching this a bit different so that we can, maybe I'll get through this book by the end of the year. We'll see what happens. But the advantage of organization imposes order and direction, or otherwise random, relatively diffuse, unfocused, or erratic phenomena in order to generate a focused, concentrated form of power directed toward accomplishing particular goals. This is why we have to get organized. Because we get organized, we're able to if we get organized, or if we're organized, we're able to maneuver, we're able to organize or move our community in a way that can get things done, right? We're able to organize our community in a way that can be able to deal with the other groups of people who come into our community not working in the interest of the community. So, for instance, like the stores that come in our community, I always talk about this. Not always. Maybe I don't talk about it enough. But if you think about even the businesses in our community, and these businesses who are people who are not from the community, and they sell product in the community, there's 2 things that can be done. For one, the store owners, whoever has these businesses, the people in that community, don't get me wrong, they pay a tax, but that tax is going to the state, and the state is deciding what to do with the resources. And what happens is when the state gets it, there's a history of the state using those resources to benefit other people disproportionately than the people who are paying taxes in that community, right? So more money is being spent on people who don't necessarily need the resources as much as the people in the community, but they're getting more resources. This is what happens. And so So we need a direct tax. If we're organized, that's something that we can do. If we have a liberation school, we can go to these businesses and say, hey, we need these resources every month. And I'm not saying we have to come like the mafia and, hey, we need 50% of your profit or something like that. The mafia, they real gangster with it. But we need to be, hey, we need these resources to be sustaining. We know that you're doing this much money in the community. We see how many people are coming into your store. We know that you're making enough money to be able to give us this to sustain our liberation schools. This is what we need. We do that to all of these businesses who are taking the resources out of the community. And at the end of the day, these people are not spending money in the community. They make the money and they take it somewhere else. So this is a way that we can keep those resources in the community directly, right? The other thing that we can do, if we're organized, we're able to even certain products that's being sold in these stores. Pepsi, well, we shouldn't be drinking Pepsi anyway, but Pepsi, if you want to have product in our community, and this store is going to carry your product, then you need to be giving this amount of resources to the community. And if not, then your product isn't being sold in this community. How are people able to come on our corners? I'm going to take it to the streets now. They're able to set up shop on our corners and sell product. Right? And the community don't have no say in what these stores is selling. Right? We're not taxing. So this is something I'll revisit another time because I can spend all day talking about this particular strategy. But these are things I want to see. But this is what we can do if we get organized. Organized networks and power. Social organizations as power networks are structured forms of social control and simultaneously are the means of attaining control. Right? Social organizations as power networks are structured forms of social control and simultaneously are the means of attaining social control. Social organizations wields influence. Influence has power, brings about changes, and does work. Therefore, it expresses power. The dynamic pattern of social relations or interactions between the members of a social organization provides the means by which it does its work or expresses its power. This is a power network or power networks. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this, again, like we have power networks within our community that are underutilized. I know one thing that we're doing NPM in New York is connecting with a lot of different organizations that are doing work in the community. And on a large scale, are we exercising the power of states? At this time, no. But within the community, we're talking about just within the community that you reside in or you're doing work in, you're able to exercise a lot of power within that community by building these power networks. People who are in the community focusing on education or focusing on community cleanup, focusing on reparations, organizations are focusing on different things that you're able to build with these power network with these different organizations, social organizations. You're able to get a lot more done. And that's one thing that we have been struggling to do. And one thing we've had as a movement, we've struggled with in the past is developing these power networks. So he's talking about that. 4 sources of social power. Since social organizations may be conceived of as social power networks, the societies they may be said to constitute may in turn be perceived as consisting of multiple overlapping and intersecting social spatial networks of power. And another quick point is when we look at the state and how the state is able to exercise power over its population is because of the social network that it has created. It has built this social network. That's one thing about the state that we're dealing with. Like, it's built as capitalism is developing, these social power networks are beginning to develop. This bureaucracy is being developed. There's an article, I think I brought this up before, war making The state, the building of the state is a racket. I probably butchered that name right there. But Charles Tilly, if you look up Charles Tilly, and I want to get the correct title, but Charles Tilly, this is an article I read years ago, and he talked about this development of capitalism. He didn't name capitalism per se, but the development of the state and this bureaucracy. But this is happening simultaneously with capitalism. Charles Tilly, war making and state making, war making and state making in the contemporary third world. Yeah. So these four sources of social power. Let me go back there. Four sources of social power: ideological, economic, military, political. These are organizations, institutional means of attaining human goals. The primacy comes from the particular organizational means each possesses to attain human goals. So there's the desire to have these sources of power isn't just the desire to have ideological power for ideological power's sake, for its own sake, or economic power for its own sake. It's because of what they can attain or what people can attain from these things. So when we think about building power among ourselves, these four sources of social power, are we exercising ideological power? Are we exercising economic power? Are we exercising military power or political power? Is there other groups of people exercising these things over us? Right? And so, because this is how the colonizer, as he's developing and creating power among themselves, these are the things that they are attaining at the expense of African people, at the behest of African people as well. So these are things that we have to overturn as we move forward and build power. So collective power, social organization amplifies power, is a collective source of power in that it involves a means by which persons may enhance their joint power over third parties or their environment by cooperating with each other. Dr. Wilson, he says collective power, that is the power of a group as a whole, may be maximized by its distributive power. That is by its internal organization and division of function or labor, the specialization of function at appropriate levels, and the coordination of functions through supervision and under central direction, right? And I mean, one way to look at this is even within an organization. I know we get into organizations, we may be a part of an organization, or even at work, where sometimes we feel like we're doing everything, we're doing all of the work, right? And this isn't effective or efficient. But when you're able to distribute that power amongst the group, amongst the people who are a part of the institution, you're able to be more effective and efficient in exercising collective power. And this is with that distributive power, being able to get people to specialize in certain things. That's distributive power. Weakly organized groups which lack collective organization or hold collective organizations are inadequate, are vulnerable to being, or in actuality, organizationally outmaneuvered by more powerfully organized groups, right? So again, anybody that's exercising power over you, a group, it has a lot to do with them being more organized than you are in politics, in economics, militarily, more organized than you. Attaining and sustaining power, the ability of a social group to defend its independence or to be liberated from domination, is related to its extensive power, intensive power, authoritative power, and diffuse power. I'm just going to go through each one of these quickly. Extensive power is the ability, extensive power is the ability to organize large numbers of people over far-flung territories in order to engage in minimally stable cooperation. I give this example of this map of the U.S., who has its military bases all over the place, right? That's extensive power. African internationalism or Pan-Africanism, the development of these relationships with African people all over the world, with a single interest, that's extensive power. That's being able to exercise extensive power. And there's levels to it, right? Intensive power is the ability to organize tightly and command a high level of mobilization or commitment from the participants, whether the area and numbers covered are great or small, right? That's why a country like Japan or a country like Korea, North and South Korea, right, are able to exercise relative power being small countries because of how high level the mobilization and commitment from the participants, right, is, where you may have a country that may be large, but if there's internal division or civil strife among the people, then they can be easily dominated and controlled by another group of people. And this is what Africa has to develop, is this intensive power, extensive power and intensive power. When we talk about what's happening within the continent internally. Authoritative power versus diffuse power. Authoritative power is the degree to which participants willingly comply to the commands and recommendations of its legitimate institutions and authority. I want to go back to one other thought about intensive power. Even in your community, if you can organize a block, you're able to exercise a lot more power over the community than the other blocks who are not organized, right? If there's 50 people that live on your block and you are able to organize those 50 people to move in one direction, and to pull their resources together to get things done in the community, you'll be able to exercise more power than any other block in that community because they're unorganized. They're not together. You're able to come on their block and do more on their block than they are able to do. Right? You're able to organize their block and become an authority in a sense because you're more organized. And their organization is only a result of your organization. This isn't something that I'm advocating because this is what colonizers do. This is what colonizers do. What we should be doing, though, is showing those other blocks how we organize and how that they can organize their block and then come together and work together and form a sort of a larger structure, right? Where we're working together on an equal basis, right? That was that little bit. See, I don't know. I know how the colonizer operates so much. I'm so been so infused or inundated with the colonizers' teachings and ways that sometimes they even come when I'm thinking, I'll be thinking like the colonizer, not necessarily acting, but just understanding the way that they think. Diffuse power is the degree. That's why I can give so many of these. I can give good examples of just all of these ideas and concepts. Diffuse power is the degree to which participants spontaneously, consciously, or unconsciously, individually, and of their own free will engage in similar social practices that embody power relations but are not explicitly commanded, based on the understanding that these practices are natural or more a result from the self-evident common interest. This right here, too, is important when we think about when African people, wherever we are, like you can go to some places, you go to Philadelphia, there's a certain way that Africans in Philadelphia may dress, talk, and so forth, right? Brooklyn, Bronx, Detroit, wherever you go, Ghana, Nigeria, African people act in a particular way that you can make a sort of a distinction. And then there's things that sort of transcend boundaries where you'd be like, oh, we do that here, we do that there. But there's always this uniqueness, right? When we're looking at the cultures. But where you have the Africans who are in Philadelphia, where I'm at, we may talk or behave a certain way. Like there's this sort of collectiveness among us, whether it's conscious or unconscious. There's just a way that we move and do things, right? But there's an influence that is happening too, in which we behave in a way. Let me put it this way: there's things that we create among ourselves, and we have an influence on each other. But then there's this outside influence on the way that we behave and act. And so when we talk about African people not resisting the system of colonialism, it's because we have been sort of shaped and molded into acting and behaving a particular way within the system that isn't a threat to the system. But this is how you maintain power. This is what we're talking about, diffuse power. Diffuse power is the degree which you have masses of people acting in a particular way, but it's in the interest of the system. The way that you behave is in the interest of the people who are in power, not against that interest. So collective identity, consciousness, intentionality, and solidarity are the key determinants as to whether a group recognizes the resources it has in its possession and whether and how it will use those resources, right? Like if we're able to organize in a way where even if we're not a part of the same organization, there's just certain things that we do as African people that's going to benefit African people. Like even the whole idea of buying black, right? Which I think is not a concept that really caught on. And there's some problems with that because if we're talking about buying black, what are these black businesses doing? Are they building up colonialism, or are they taking those resources and they're bringing it back to the communities and supporting the communities that are supporting them? So that's a whole thing. But if we have people who are doing this, right, supporting African businesses with the intention that those businesses are support, and everybody's doing that, and not necessarily a part of the same nation, but it's sort of an idea, it's a consciousness that we have, right? This is a way to exercise or have exercise diffuse power in a sense. So we have to think of actions and things that we can do as a collective, making sure we check what they say on code. I don't use it because I hear people say it so much, but because that different connotations when you say that. But that's a being on code where you can have people who are on code, and we're like, no, this is we don't do certain things, and there's certain things that we do because we know that it is in the interest of our people. Then we're moving in the right direction for Black power. So collective resources, organization, identity, or solidarity are themselves the fundamental collective resources underlying and making the mobilization of all others. The most obvious collective resources are those created by the pooling of individual resources for employment in the service of a common aim. The most important collective resources are unambiguously classifiable as non-reducible or global properties of groups, namely solidarity and organization. Right? So, coming together state is not going to get us free. But collective resources coming together with the intention, though, being very intentional about it and having a strategy and plan, that is a way that we can bring about the sort of revolutionary change that's needed. And there's things that we can do through organization coming together that we can't do if we're not organized. But I think the second, in regards, I think an example that is being made is resources, money. If you can bring 1 million people together, that's a pool of people. You pull resources together. Just think of how much you can get done. And this is even on a smaller scale. But I think if you look at these two, I'm going to read these again. He says the most obvious, and then he goes on to say the most important. I think this is something I need to highlight. The most obvious collective resources are those created by the pooling of individual resources for employment in the service of a common aim, right? One aim, one destiny, Marcus Garvey, right? But he says the most important collective resources are unambiguously classifiable as non-reducible or global properties of groups, namely solidarity and organization. This second part that he's talking about, this non-reducible part, he's talking about the collective consciousness or the ideas. This is more abstract, right? But it's the ideas and this collective consciousness that is going to bring people together. So sources of organizational power. The struggle for power often appears to be largely a contest between organizations. The power of highly organized groups is only checked by the opposition of other groups. Wealth, numbers, and specialized facilities is the obvious advantage of organization in that it brings together the efforts of a large number of people along with a great deal of wealth. Coordinated membership response. The major source of organizational power lies in the ability to enable many people to take planned, concerted action to affect social divisions. So some of the factors that's affecting group power is size and organizational power. Of course, mere size by itself doesn't mean that work is going to get done, right? Because you can have a small group of people that's organized that's going to be able to attain more, that can attain more than a large group that that is organized. And that has a lot to do with maybe internal struggles or conflicts, theoretical struggles, and so forth, right? So mere size, but this is one of the factors that's affecting group power. Cohesiveness and action orientation, perceived role as a power factor, organizational alliances, and countervailing power. So I intended to like go through each one of those, but because of the sake of time, I'm not going to go through each one of those, right? I have a few slides left that I'm going to go through, but there will be a time where I'm going to come back to those particular points. So the expression of mass power, the power of mass markets, mass veto power through non-cooperation. And we're talking about masses of people coming together right now. The power that can be exercised, things that can be done as a result. Direct political power of the masses and breaking the habits of obedience. In an unjust social order, where one group abusively dominates another, the habit of obedience in a subordinate or abused group functions to maintain that order. Y'all hear that, right? Subordinate groups thereby collude with the dominant group to perpetuate its own subordination and exploitation. Ethnic solidarity and power. I think I have maybe just a few more slides left, maybe like 3 or 4. So I'm just going to wind it down. Ethnicity, solidarity, and power. Most often a group is formed based on the sharing among its members of a common history, set of values, fate, plight, or on their consciousness of a shared collective identity, such as socioeconomic classes, political or social category, or ethnicity. An organization wins submission to its purpose outside the organization only as it wins submission within, right? So you have to be on point. You have to be organized internally, everybody on the same page and in alignment. If you are able to do that, then you have a better chance of organizing the people. That's why the movement has been struggling so much, is because they see so much disunity among the Black nationalists, Pan-Africanist organizations, and it makes it difficult to get the masses of people to make a choice or to want to be a part, because now it's like this trust thing. Who can they trust, especially when the organizations are openly struggling against each other over ideology, practice, and so forth. So we have to do a better job. The strength and reliability of its external power depends on the depth and certainty of internal submission. The achievement of group solidarity and organization results from the mobilization of previously disunited individuals in order to create an active power they may already have possessed but could not employ or will due to the absence of will and the facilitating group ideology. And I got page 45 here. Again, I was going to go through this page 45 because what is said here I thought was like really important. And again, I think I'm going to come back to it. Ethnics and class resources, race ideology, and the exploitability of Black Americans. Dr. Wilson explains how ethnicity and organization based on ethnicity are utilized as sources of power in order to develop ethnically based economic power resources. And what Dr. Wilson is going to do in other parts of this book too is give examples of how other groups are able to, again, come into African communities and benefit at the expense of African people, which has to do with the disorganization in those communities. So he talks about immigrant entrepreneurship as something, self-employment within the immigrant group at a rate much in excess of the general rate. This takes place. Ethnic entrepreneurship denotes ethnic minority specialization in self-employment without imposing the requirement of foreign-born origin. The entrepreneurship of immigrant groups is explained by their resources, ethnic resources, those special features of a group which co-ethnic business owners utilize in business or from which their business passively benefits. So what Dr. Wilson is talking about, the you can call nepotism that takes place, or cronyism that takes place among these ethnic groups when they come into our communities. They're working. They have created a power network to their advantage and the disadvantage of African people. And we have been put in a position where we have been weakened by the system of colonialism because of centuries of racism, right? And because of centuries of creating this idea of inferiority and inadequacy in the African population, where we legitimize the system that has created who we are, in a sense. And don't get me wrong, we have been agents and we have been able to have say in who we are and what we want to do to an extent, but it has been under the domination of, under the political and economic domination of Europeans. So we have been limited in what we could be within this system. If we was outside of this system, we would be a whole lot more advanced. We wouldn't even be able to recognize ourselves outside of colonialism. So I'm going to increase in power. Dr. Wilson, he says the ownership of property, wealth, organization, race consciousness, and ideology as potential and actual power resources can be combined to increase group well-being and power. A group whose members share a strong sense of identity and purpose that are employed to define and motivate its organization, a shared sense of a group solidarity, and a shared sense that it can determine its destiny rather than have it determined by outsiders, possess the preconditions and prerequisites for power. This is why we say we African, African people, because there are African people who may have different cultures and are part of a different ethnic group all over the world. But what is something that we can say that we can all identify with, and that's being African. And so that transcends the divisions that we have among ourselves, because now as African people, we can begin to develop strategies. We can begin to develop objectives and goals for African people and not necessarily for the individual. Now, there's things that we can do in the communities where we are, wherever we are, we have to develop some sort of direction and policy that's going to benefit those people who are on the ground. But as African people, we can come together and we can create a system where nobody's left behind. And this is why we all have to sit down at the table and have that discussion, and not do what the European head did when he sat down the Berlin Conference and there wasn't one single African there. Black American economic subordination is the result of deliberate economic oppression by other groups, primarily the white American community, aided and abetted by immigrant groups, and secondarily the result of the failure of African American leadership to forge a race-based ideological consensus and economic program. And this is what I'm talking about. Dr. Wilson talks about race a lot, but I want to say nation, African nation, right? You're dealing with race, you're dealing with pseudoscience, the European creation. I want to talk about the African nation. If you want to, it can be used interchangeably. Organize it for Black power, phases for economic system development. Based on its present configuration, the full development of an African American economic system requires that it undergoes a number of phases. And he's talking actually in the book. If you go in the book, he also has a plan for a political structure in the book. But here he lays out some phases for economic system of development. He says founding and establishment. Phase 1, founding and establishment of a broad base of retail and service outlets. Phase 2, the institution of wholesale and distribution centers to service the already established retail and service markets, right? And we have service and retail markets in existence now, whether on a small scale in some cities or a large scale, but nationally and internationally, this exists. So in the second phase, he's talking about the institution of wholesale and distribution centers to service our retail and service markets, where we don't have to go to the colonizer or the enemy to be able to, for them to service our retail, where they have to go to them to buy wholesale. Third phase, the founding and expansion of a manufacturing and raw material sector, right? We're processing and manufacturing of these raw materials ourselves and not outsourcing it to the colonizer who's going to sell it back to us for 10, 20 times what it's worth. The founding and expansion of the financial service sectors, which will supply the financial needs of the consumers, retails and services, wholesale, distribution, and manufacturing sectors of the community. The entering into export-import trade relations across the African diaspora as part of the global Pan-African economic system and with other nations selling both goods and services. When you get to that point, when you import and export, we don't need, but the state, what's going to happen is the state going to want to put some tariffs. They're going to want to tax that import and export, right? This is why sovereignty is important, because now for us to import and export, we got to go through the colonizer. Contradiction. So the Black American nation within the nation, Dr. Wilson, he actually goes to Dr. Chancellor Williams' book, The Destruction of Black Civilization, and goes through Dr. Chancellor Wilson's the steps to develop sort of this nation within the nation and the advantages of the nation within the nation. Is something else that I think we can come back to. But there's 8 steps that he lays out in the book. But he says, well-organized, socially coherent, and cohesive nation states provide the best means for the accumulation and exercise of collective power resources. To the degree that a social group can approach nation state status, this is what we got to do. And even on an informal, non-declared level, it can create, accumulate, and maximally utilize its collective resources as media of its social power and will. Just think of the respect that we will get as a people from others if they see an independent, strong African nation with no neo-colonialists. We get excited anytime we see a coup, and we be praying that it's somebody that's going to come into power, that's going to promote the destruction and the dismantling of colonialism all throughout Africa and wherever African people are. We just hope for that, right? And so this is something that we need. And so when Dr. Wilson, he talks about utilizing its collective resources as a media of its social power and will, like we will be able to, this is something just like the media is able to portray and project certain images. The fact that we develop this type of nation will be able to project the image that will empower African people everywhere. The failure of the African American community to see itself as a nation consequently has resulted in its domination and exploitation by other groups that possess a modicum of social solidarity and organization, right? And so pages 52 to 55 on here, I was going to go through, but I think I kept this podcast going for more than 2 hours. So I'm going to pause right there. And this is there's definitely some information that I'm going to want to revisit. Man, I was about to go 2.5 hours, more than 2.5 hours. So this is the longest I went, but I appreciate everybody tuning in. I'm going to end it right now, but at 4:00, I'm actually, if everything goes well with the internet connection, I'm going to be interviewing some comrades in Burkina Faso. That's in Burkina Faso, and we're going to be talking about what's happening in the Sahel. Actually, no, we're pre-recording. We're pre-recording, so I'm going to give you guys a rest. We're going to pre-record that, and I'm going to air that sometime this week. We tried to do it on, I think, when did we try to do that? We tried to do it Sunday, I believe. No, Friday. We tried to do it Friday, but they were dealing with all types of internet connectivity problems, and the electricity went out on them. I'm like, man, in Africa, that is just something I have to commend these brothers and sisters to be able to struggle through that. Because what would we do if our electricity will be going out, sporadically like that throughout the day or throughout the week? Man, we would be losing our mind. All right, let me give myself a rest though. All right, appreciate y'all tuning in. Next Tuesday, 1:00, I'll be coming back with chapter 3. And y'all can see me this Thursday. I'm going to be doing Dr. Amerson Wilson's, covering Dr. Amerson Wilson's Black on Black Violence. So till next time, Black Power, Uhuru, get organized, as Kwame Ture used to say, get organized. And if you're not, join organization.